Hello, everyone. My name is Shazad Mirza. We're going to start in about 6, 7 minutes. Just as a reminder, there is a questions box that is available to you in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you do have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to post those questions up on that questions box, and we'll do our best to answer the questions as we go along. If you don't get to those questions, then we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the webinar. So again, we'll start in about 6 to 7 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Shazad Mirza, Director of Operations Global Cyber Alliance. We're going to be starting in about 3 minutes. Just as a reminder, there is a questions box that is available to you on your GoToWebinar control panel. If at any point in time you have any questions, please feel free to post those questions there. So again, we'll be starting in about 3 minutes. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of the DMARC Bootcamp. My name is Shazad Mirza. I am the Director of Operations. So what we're doing today in week 4, so sorry, before I get into that, even before we start, so just a reminder, so weeks 1 and 2. So weeks 1, we talked about an overview of DMARC. Week 2, we went into the technical details about what SPF and DKIM are and how they function. So week 3 and 4 is now it's actually time to implement. So what we're going to do here is, if you attended last week in weeks 3, this week's 4 is going to be a repeat of that week. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to go through and talk about DMARC in more detail. We're going to talk about the policy more specifically and what are the different components involved in that policy. And then once we're done with that, the last half of this session, we're going to show you how to create SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records on a Windows DNS machine. So that is what we're going to do during this session today. We're also encouraging people that during these last few weeks to go ahead and go implement DMARC. Implement DMARC at the lowest level, because at this point we've given you enough information to actually start off with DMARC and create that DMARC policy. And then weeks 5 and 6 is where you're going to get the additional information about the reports that you're going to be receiving from DMARC. So we could talk about ongoing management. So how to analyze, how to review these reports, and what adjustments may need to be made in order to allow you to get up to the enforcement levels of DMARC. So like I said, when we talked about DMARC, we didn't really talk about DMARC as of week 1. So let's get back into as a reminder, what DMARC is. So DMARC itself stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. And what DMARC is going to do is going to make it so that way that your domain that you're using, whether it be for email purposes or not for email purposes, to protect that domain and prevent people, untrusted sources, and other people that are unauthorized to use your domain from sending on your behalf. So it lets you have more control over your domain. So now remember, with DMARC, there's 2 parts to it. There's the DMARC policy and there's DMARC verification. It's the policy that you're going to create as the sending organization to let the receiving side know, hey, our messages are protected. We have these authentication mechanisms in place. Make sure you check them. And if those mechanisms were to fail, this is what you're going to do with that particular message. So follow the policy that I define, and that's how you treat those particular messages. But remember, in order for this to work, the receiving side must have DMARC verification enabled, because otherwise they're not going to be able to check for DMARC policies of other organizations, right? Because the DMARC verification is going to say, all right, I'm getting all these messages coming in. I need to check each one for a DMARC policy. If there's a DMARC policy, I need to follow that policy accordingly. If there is no policy, then we'll go through my other filters. But or the filters could come first and then DMARC comes later on. But either way, it's going to just go through the regular filters that you have, right? So DMARC policy is something that you have to create. You actually have to define the policy and create the policy. DMARC verification is typically just a check mark that you have to implement and put and turn on your filtering systems, whether it be your email security gateway, a filtering cloud provider, or anything like that. Typically, those are the ones, that's where you're going to put in your DMARC verification. So we're not going to focus on DMARC verification. We're going to focus on the policy, because there's different components to that and how to create it. Whereas verification, there's just too many systems to try to cover them all. So things that you may need when it comes to creating this policy. I mean, you have to consider having your mail systems available to you. Know which mail systems are available, what they are. You're not going to really need those for DMARC so much, but you're going to need them more so when you create your SPF and DKIM records. So it's more necessary and needed for that in that situation. But you do need access to DNS. So whether it's you yourself who has admin access to DNS, or maybe there is a DNS admin in your IT environment that you actually have to go to them and tell them, like, look, I need to create the records. But they're going to want to know the records that you want them to create. They're not going to just create them for you, right? They're going to need to know what the policy is for SPF. What are the DKIM keys that I need to put in and records I need to put in, and what exactly for DMARC do I need to put in? If you have them, have a list of subdomains. I mean, it's not a big deal if you do not have them. If you don't have them, that's fine. Let it, don't worry about it. You can still proceed. But if you have them, it does help a little bit, because then that way you can determine, are any of these domains being used for email, or are they not being used for email? Because that's the factor you have to look into. Then if you have them, SPF and DKIM, right? So for SPF and DKIM, remember, when you're implementing DMARC, you do need to have them. But if you're at the lowest level of DMARC, you can actually put in a DMARC policy at the lowest level and then not have SPF and DKIM, right? Because then what will happen is when you get reports, you can review the reports and start building your SPF record as accordingly based on those reports, and then define the DKIM keys as needed. But it's only if you stay at the lowest level, because once you reach the highest level or go into the enforcement levels, things will start breaking if SPF or DKIM are not set up correctly. Right, so what are those three levels? The three policy settings are none, quarantine, and reject. So you can start off with a DMARC policy of none without SPF and DKIM, because at this point you're still building things, right? Because DMARC at policy none means a monitored only mode. So basically telling the receiving side, like, look, yeah, I have a policy, but I'm not enforcing it. So I'm not going to, no messages that, don't look, you can look at my policy, but none of the messages are going to be impacted by this. Right, and the main reason for this is, again, I want to receive the reports from you because I want to see what you're seeing. I want to see if you're getting messages from me and in all my authorized systems, and if you're getting any messages from any unauthorized systems. This way I can see all this and then make adjustments that I need to make. It's like, oh, I forgot this particular domain or IP that we're actually using for sending messages. I need to go update my SPF. I need to see if there's DKIM, there's DKIM, so I need to add the DKIM record on as well. So at none, you're really just going through and making sure everything is configured correctly and set up correctly by getting all those reports. So you're managing your environment and you're making the adjustments. Now, once you know or you feel more comfortable that SPF and DKIM are set up to your acceptable levels, then you go up to quarantine and reject. Right? So you do not go to quarantine or reject without having SPF or DKIM in place, because you could potentially break things. I mean, ideally you should have both, but technically you could get away with one or the other. But best practice, start off at none and then work your way up to reject at that point. So what do these records look like in DNS? For DMARC is always going to be a TXT record. There may be some cases or situations where you may have somebody managing your DNS, or you can redirect to them, and that's where you may use a CNAME. And a few providers out there do that. But typically, it's always going to be a TXT record that you're going to create in DNS. Now, when you're creating a record in DNS, there's various components to it. So with TXT, there's two. There's a host name, and then there's a text box or a value that you're going to define. Right? So the host name for the TXT and for DMARC TXT records always is _ DMARC. That underscore has to be present in DMARC in lowercase. So if you forget that underscore, what happens? Basically, with the receiving side, if they have verification enabled, they're not going to see the policy. They can't find it because they're looking for underscore DMARC. So make sure you put in underscore DMARC, and then afterwards, after the underscore DMARC, after that, you may have to put in your fully qualified domain name. A lot of it depends on the type of system that you need and the type of system you're using and where you're placing it within that system. Right, so in this case, we'll focus on that and how to actually create it towards the end on a Windows system. So once you define your host name as underscore DMARC, then you have to supply a value to that record. And that value is the actual policy itself. So these are going to be the different components that you're putting into the policy. And that's the policy we're going to have separated by tags. So what are all of these tags? What do they mean? So we're going to go through each one of these in slides, but this is just to give you a little cheat sheet so you can see which ones we're saying are required, recommended, and the ones that are considered optional. So the ones that are required. So the first one you see is V equals DMARC 1. Right, that's defining the version of DMARC that's being used. And it's always going to be V equals DMARC 1. Okay, there is no 2, there's no 3 or 4. You may have heard of DMARC version 2.0. It's not really V equals DMARC 2. what the people are calling 2.0 is really is another standard that's being released called BIMI, B-I-M-I. So that works in conjunction with DMARC. So BIMI is actually using another authentication mechanism, which is imaging. So it uses an image. You define this image as considered. If you see this image, it's now your domain it's authenticated. But again, it works with DMARC, but only if you have DMARC with the reject policy that it will work. But I'm not going to go more into that. That I can go into more in October 17th during the wrap-up session. I'll talk a little bit more about BIMI then. So always V equals DMARC 1. The thing is, after the DMARC 1, it's a semicolon. So semicolon, right? So every tag with the value of that tag is separated by a semicolon. Okay? So V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, and then the next tag. And the next tag is always going to be P equals. And the policy level that you want to define. So P equals none, P equals quarantine, or P equals reject. So remember, only one DMARC record per domain, not including subdomains. So one DMARC policy per domain. So V equals DMARC 1 comes first, semicolon, P equals, then the policy level, semicolon, comes second. This always has to start this way. And after that, you can put whatever tags in any order. So V equals, then P equals, and then any other tag. Okay. Now, the other thing to take into account with a P tag, what does the P tag apply to? It does apply to the domain that you are applying the policy to, as well as the subdomains for that particular domain. So if I put in, if at globalcyberalliance.org, I put in V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals quarantine, that means all messages, if they fail authentication, go to the spam junk folder for globalcyberalliance.org and its subdomains. So like sales.globalcyberalliance.org, marketing.globalcyberalliance.org, those all apply with the P tag. So top level domain as well as the sub level domains associated with that domain that you're applying the policy to. Now, after this is where you're going to define your reporting mechanism. So it doesn't have to be right after that, but again, V version, the P equals, and then after this, any order. But I'm just going in a specific order just to show you the tags. But these are the RUA tag and the RUF tag are your reporting tags. This is where you're enabling reporting with this. So if you leave out RUA and RUF, you will not get reports. Okay, now in our case, we're saying that RUA is required and RUF is recommended. Okay, technically, you do not need them. Okay, you do not need to put them in. I should reiterate that. Technically, you don't have to put them in, but we're requiring that and recommending that you put these in. The reason for this is because if you do only V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals none, what have you done? You've done nothing. You put yourself into monitored mode, but for doing what? For doing nothing, right? You're not getting reports. So how do you know you're supposed to go up to quarantine or reject, right? Because P equals none there's no filtering going on. There's no, even if someone were to look at your policy, they can say, well, your policy is set to none. So if there's fraudulent messages, we're still letting them through. Right? So you need the RUA tag and the RUF tags to look at the reports and determine, are we ready for quarantine, and then are we ready for reject? Now, if you're at the reject level, fine. Maybe if you don't want to get the reports, that's up to you. I still recommend you would still get the reports even at reject, right? Because you'll use it from a different perspective in that case, right? And plus you'll have something that's available to you to see, okay, our message is being dropped because of DMARC. So at none and quarantine, definitely have the reports, but a reject, I'll leave it up to you. It's your choice. I still recommend having reporting at all 3 levels. So now how do you use this? So RUA equals mail to colon and then the email address. Semicolon RUF equals mail to and then the email address. Simple as that. So you just pop that in and there you go. Right? So what are the difference between aggregate and forensic failure reports? So aggregate reports are the ones we're saying that you're requiring it because that's the one that's actually going to tell you all the information. right? That's the one that's going to give you the IP address of whomever is sending using your domain, right? So I'm saying whomever. So that means it'll be the IP address of legitimate servers, of third-party vendors, as well as those spammers and phishers. Plus, on top of that, you also get to find out about SPF. Is SPF passing or failing? What's the domain for SPF that's being used? And is it being aligned? You also know about DKIM. Is DKIM passing or failing? What's the domain being used by DKIM? Is DKIM domain alignment in place? That's why we recommend and requiring RUA. Have the RUA tag in there. Then RUF, forensic or failure reports, you may not get too many of these because these are more the actual sample message. So it becomes a privacy concern with those messages, because those messages could contain who it's being sent to, who was actually sending it. It could have the full body of the message, full header of the message. It could even go as far as having attachments. So some just example forensic failure reports that I've seen, a lot of times I see out of office messages, or a lot of times it'd be bounce back messages, but there are cases where I've seen invoices. So it's an invoice, and you probably don't want the IT admin or the email admin or whoever is going to be responsible for these DMARC reports to see those kinds of things, right? So because it becomes a privacy concern. So it's kind of a balance here, like trying to figure out, okay, well, yes, it's a privacy concern, but at the same time, it could help them figure out, okay, what are the things that need to be adjusted? Because here's a specific message that failed because of DMARC. So that way they know what actually specifically to look at. So it's a very, you have to take a balanced approach and decide which one outweighs the other. So when you're actually putting these in here, so here are some examples. So RUA equals mail2, DMARC-RUA at company.com, semicolon RUF equals mail2, and then the email address. So we do recommend you use a generic account rather than a personal account, really for two reasons. One, you don't know how many reports you're going to get. You could get anywhere from 5 reports to potentially hundreds of reports, right? It's going to really depend on how many emails you sent out on a certain time frame and how many domains are receiving those, right? Because if you send to 100 different receiving domains, you could get 100 reports back. And that's assuming they all have DMARC verification enabled and that they're all willing to send reports back. Okay. And the other reason is remember, a DMARC policy, the DMARC record is publicly accessible. So anyone publicly can find your DMARC record. So you may not want to put your personal work account in there. So it's something that could take into consideration. You can have more than one email address, right? You just have to separate them by commas. So RUA equals mail2, the first email address, comma, mail2, the second email address, comma, mail2, the third email address, comma, so on and so forth. And then when you're done, semicolon, and then the next tag that you're going to be using. So you can have more than one email address. And by default, you can only send to an email within your own domain. You can actually send it to emails outside of your domain, but there's a little bit more effort involved. And that's from the receiving side. So the external organization you want to send this to, they actually have to create a record on their end in order to accept those reports. So those are all the required and recommended tags. So the next tags that we're going to talk about in the next few slides are your optional tags. So optional meaning that you don't have to put them in place. So you don't have to explicitly define them. And if you do not explicitly define them, those tags will automatically be using the default setting for it, right? So if you do not put it in, it automatically uses the default setting for that tag. So the first one here, as you see, is the FO tag. So the FO tag is used in conjunction with the RUF tag. The reason why, because what the FO tag is going to do is going to say, how are we triggering these forensic failure reports? So what are we basing this on in order to send those message samples to the sending organization? So that way the receiving side knows what to do. By default, it's FO equals 0. So that means that it'll generate a report if all authentication mechanisms have failed to produce an aligned pass result. Right, so SPF, DKIM, everything is failing. Or sorry, all of them are failing to produce an aligned pass result. FO equals 1 if it's any underlying, so either or. So not both. So it's not saying SPF and DKIM. One is saying SPF or DKIM, then produce something other than a aligned pass result. D is for strictly DKIM, and S is strictly for SPF. Most commonly one I've seen used is actually 1, but a lot of people leave out the FO tag as well, so they just stick with the 0. The next one is ADKIM and ASPF. So remember in week 2, when we talked about SPF and DKIM, we talked about SPF verification and DKIM verification, right? So for SPF verification, we said that the envelope from domain is what's being checked. So as long as the envelope from is there is correct, and the IPs and domains associated with that SPF are correct, everything is going to pass, right? If the IPs and domains associated on the SPF are not there, it's considered a fail. For DKIM, it's looking at the domain and the signature, right? And making sure, okay, this is the domain, here's the public key, or sorry, here's the domain, here's the signature and the hash and the message, compare it to that domain with the public key and see if everything is matched, right? So it's not really doing alignment though. As we also mentioned about SPF and DKIM alignment. Those two things are important because DMARC is where it's going to include the alignment aspect as well. So it's going to say we need to check DKIM and SPF alignment, make sure it's coming from the right domain. So by default, the values for both of these is R. R standing for relaxed alignment. And the other option is S, or strict alignment. So when we put relaxed alignment, what does that mean? That means that the domain doesn't have to match exactly. It can be a subdomain of that domain. So it's globalcyberalliance.org. You can use sales.marketing.org, sales or marketing.globalcyberalliance.org. Those are allowed in relaxed mode or relaxed alignment. And you see that in a lot of cases because of third-party vendors, because the third-party vendors tend to sometimes use subdomains. So you have to be careful there, and that's why, you know, majority of the time you don't see people using ADKIM or ASPF. But how do you know? It's from those reports, the DMARC reports, the aggregate reports are going to tell you about alignment. So if you go into your aggregate reports and you see that, like, look, everything is aligning correctly. So it's always using globalcyberalliance.org. It's never using any subdomains, but then it's always in alignment. So everything's actually really working very well. Then that's where you can go ahead and put in ADKIM equals S or ASPF equals S, right? You don't have to have them both in there. You can have one or the other. Because remember, the default is set to R. So if you just put in ADKIM equals S and leave out ASPF, that means ASPF is going to be equal to R. RF and RI tags. So RF is going to define what report format is going to be followed. So what's the format of the reports that are being delivered, and what is the reporting interval for RI? So how often are those reports to be delivered by the receiving side? So for RF, you have two options, AFRF and IODEF. I supply the RFCs for both. So that way, if you really want to go into and deep dive into it, you can go into it. But either way, the report is always going to be in an XML format. No matter which report format you use, it's always going to be XML. So that way, the aggregate reporting systems can actually consume these reports. Only time you ever probably use this is if you're pulling these reports into like an instant response type system or something like that, where it's going to matter which one you choose. But I have not really seen many people use RF IODEF. They just stick with AFRF, and in fact, they even just leave out the RF tag completely and let it be the default. And then the RI is in seconds. So reporting interval is in seconds. By default, it's 84,600 seconds, which is 24 hours. So 84,600 is 24 hours. You can adjust that as you need. Just remember it's in seconds. So don't put in RI equals 5, because then it means you receive reports in about every 5 seconds. That'll be a lot of reports. Most cases I've seen people go down as far as an hour. And mainly people do that because they want to try to get to implement DMARC at quarantine or reject relatively quickly. So they're not waiting for 24 hours just to see the reports. They have the time. They may have saw something happen, or there may be some requirement that they have to follow, like maybe like a federal requirement or some sort of regional law requirement that says you have to implement DMARC. or new compliance standards or things like that, requiring you to put in DMARC. So they would reduce it so they can get those reports quicker and then make the adjustments quicker as well and get up to the policy of reject relatively quickly. And again, if you don't put in the RI tag by default, it's going to go to the 24 hours, 84,600 seconds. Then you have your PCT tag, which is your percentage tag. So that basically is going to define what percentage of messages are going to be impacted by this DMARC policy. So your value is between 0 and 100. Default is 100. Right, so if you were to put in a value of PCT equals 50, semicolon, that means that 50% of the messages are being hit by DMARC. The other 50% are not being hit by DMARC. So how do you know which one falls into which? You don't. You won't know. I mean, you can look at the reports, but the reports are just going to give, the aggregate reports are just going to give you a number of messages. It's not going to give you the details. The forensic reports will give you that information, because if you got it, that means it got hit by the policy. If you don't receive it, well, then it's possible that never got hit by the policy. But you don't really know. But people tend to use this more so for just saying, okay, well, we're going to gradually get into it. So if you put 50%, we know at least 50% of the messages will get through. The other 50%, we'll look at the reports and see what we can do. But just to be careful with this too, because if you use P equals quarantine, semicolon, P equals 0, PCT equals 0, semicolon, it's the same thing as using P equals none, right? Because you're saying that none of the messages are going to get impacted this policy, this quarantine policy. So that's P equals none, right? P equals reject, semicolon, PCT equals 0 that's the same thing as using P equals quarantine, right? Because you're saying none of these messages are going to be rejected based on our policy. So what's the next level down? It's quarantine. So that means you're basically putting in P equals quarantine at 100%. So P equals quarantine, semicolon, PCT equals 100%, 100, semicolon. So again, you don't have, if you're using PCT equals 100, you do not need to put that tag in and leave it out, because it's automatically at that point using PCT equals 100. And the last tag we're going to mention is the SP tag, and this is the last tag that's available to you. So the SP tag. Should say that's the last tag that's currently available to you, because there may be some other ones coming down the line. But that's more at the very top level, like so at the .gov.org levels. But anyways, so SP tag. So wait, hold on. There's one question about the 0. So PCT equals 0 supposedly has the effect of getting some list servers to reformat the way it sends emails so they don't fail DMARC. Yes, correct. But again, I mean, if you're at if you're at reject, those mail servers are going to technically use quarantine at that point. And when it comes to list servers, is a whole nother story when it comes to any type of authentication, whether it be SPF, DMARC, or DKIM, that's a whole nother level. So the list servers at that point, they really need to implement something called ARC, A-R-C, Authenticated Receive Change. But we're not going to get into that because it's a whole nother thing that's going on there. So back to the SP tag. So for SP, so we have the P tag, and the P tag is defining your policy for that domain and all subdomains. But the SP tag is meant for your subdomains, a policy to apply to your subdomains of the domain you're creating the policy for, right? Because there are chances that you may have subdomains that are being used. But again, if there are subdomains not being used, but you want to prevent them from being used. So what are the values for SP? So it's the same thing as the P tag. So it could be SP equals none, SP equals quarantine, or SP equals reject. All right, so those are the same exact thing as the P tag. So if you don't define SP, your subdomains automatically revert to using the P tag. So when can you use this? When do you consider using the SP tag? So one situation could be when you're first starting off and you're at P equals none, you're still going through and making changes. Right, but what you want to do is you want to protect your subdomains. You know you don't have subdomains. You know they're not being used. You may use them internally, but they're not publicly used in any way. So what do you do at that point? You put in the SP equals reject. So you'll put in P equals none, semicolon, SP equals reject, semicolon. So this way now none of your subdomains can be used. unless you have a DMARC policy applied to, but let's just say you don't, so none of those subdomains are being used for email purposes. And they're not being used by spammers for email purposes. Because we have seen cases of that happening, where people were at P equals none, and they were working on things, and all of a sudden all their subdomains were there was a subdomain somebody made up and started using it. So they put in SP equals reject, and that stopped that. It could also be the other way around, where you have multiple subdomains, and they're actually used for email purposes. But you're ready to move up for your top level domain. You're ready to go to P equals reject or P equals quarantine. So what do you do then? Because if at that point, if you put in P equals reject, all your subdomains are impacted by reject, and they don't even have an SPF policy or DKIM records in place. So things are going to break for them. So that's why then you implement SP equals none. So you put in P equals reject semicolon, SP equals none semicolon, and now what that can happen at the subdomain level is they create their SPF policies, they create their DKIM records, and they can implement their own DMARC policy at their own level. So they can work their way up at their own level and implement DMARC at a reject policy of reject whenever they're ready. So those are two types of scenarios or cases where you typically see people using the SP tag. All right, so we talked about all the different tags or everything that's there. So if you look again here, these two basic, complex, all you really need is that basic to get started. Put this in, it'll take you a few minutes. Unless you have change control, it could take a couple weeks, but typically it should only take you probably a minute or less to put in host DMARC TXT record. And I'm going to show you that in a little bit here right now. So let me switch over to my virtual machine. So here I have a Windows DNS system set up, and also have Office 365 here in the background. So we're going to use Office 365 as our tool to help create some of these records. It's not going to create all the records. It's going to help us with SPF and DKIM. We still have to create our own DMARC record. It will not tell you the DMARC record to create. That's up to you as an organization to do that. So here in Server Manager, I'm looking at DNS. So here's my DNS server here. So I'm going to right-click on it and go to DNS Manager. And then under DNS Manager is where I have my forward lookup zones. I've got DMARC.net and got DMARC.org. So got DMARC.org is the actual domain that's in use, right? Because this is here, I have A records, I have some mail exchanger records, I have a web server here. So this is what I'm going to do. So the DNS server that I'm using is a public-facing DNS server, right? It has to be public-facing, right? Because otherwise, no one from the outside is going to be able to see any of your policies or things like that. So even if it's internal to your network, it has to be accessible from the internet, from the outside, in order to be able to get the information that they need to get. Okay, so that's very important. It's got to be a public-facing DNS server that you're creating this on. So let's go ahead. Let's start creating a SPF record first. Right. So now when it comes to SPF, so most third parties will actually give you the information on what to create for your SPF record, assuming you already have one in place. Right. So you would have to create it, and you would have to develop it. Office 365, Google G Suites, and some other email service providers and third marketers will give you that information. So you can always start off with that, especially if you're doing this for the very first time. See if your primary mail provider has that information. If they do, start off with that and then do everything else secondary. So let's go ahead. We have here an Office 365 Admin Center. I can go under Setup. Under Setup, there's Domains. It shows me my two domains that I have here in O365. I'm going to go to the domain that I use. So I click on this, and it tells you these are the DNS records that are required in order for mail to work. So you have to have these three records you see here in order for this to work. If you do not have these three records, you're going to have problems. So that's why right now I have DNS errors detected. Click here to view. So you have to have an MX record, so it tells you the type. In this case, it tells you the priority of it, tells you the host name, which is an @ symbol. @ also stands for blank or none or null. So if you see an @ symbol, some DNS systems require you to put the @ symbol in there. Some of them are okay with you leaving it blank. And then where you're going to point the address to, or what the value is going to be of that record, and then the time to live. So this MX record we already have, it's already in DNS. But the next one it shows is a text record, a TXT. There's no priority associated with it. So host name is at or blank. And then here is an SPF policy. So they're flat out telling you this is what you need. But remember, if you already have an SPF policy in play, you can only have one SPF record, right? So you only need the part that you need to add to your current SPF. So I would just take this information that I'm highlighting, and this is the information that I'm going to be adding to it. Oops, too big. All right, so this is what I'm going to add to it. But in this case, since I'm doing this for the very first time, I'm going to take this whole thing. I'm going to copy it, go over to DNS, right-click on my DNS manager, and I'm going to create a TXT record, just like it said. So I'm going to go scroll down, choose Other New Records, scroll down this list to Text or TXT, and then click on Create Record. Here, the record name, remember, it says an @ symbol, so we're going to leave it blank. We're not going to put the @ symbol in here, right? Because it's going to use the parent domain, and by leaving it blank, it automatically uses the parent domain. In text is where we're putting in the value. V equals SPF1, include, and so on and so forth with a --all. I click on OK, and now I have an SPF record. Now this is where I'm going to make changes to it. And I am going to make a change because you see I actually have 2 Exchange MX as well. This SPF policy only defines the one that's used for Office 365 and not for my current ones that I have on premises. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on this, brings up the properties again, and then I'm going to make the adjustment that I need to do. I'm going to add an MX because MX means look up my MX records for this domain. I mean, I could always put in a : and then the name of the server, or I could put in IPv4 and then the IP address of the server as well. But in this case, I'm going to put in MX. And then this is where you would add in any other domains that if you're using third parties. So if you were using something like Salesforce, you would add in what Salesforce tells you to do and add in for Salesforce to this. And you keep appending to it. Just remember the 10 domain lookup, right? You can't look up more than 10 domains and then when you create an SPF record. So don't have more than 10 domains in here. And you can use online SPF checkers. They'll actually tell you if you have too many domains. So that's creating SPF and defining an SPF record. So what about DKIM? Okay, so what about DKIM? So with DKIM, again, it depends on who you're using, right? If you're using a third-party vendor, in most cases, a third-party vendor will actually have you create a CNAME record. Okay, a CNAME record is what they'll have you create. And that CNAME record is going to basically really be an alias, right? So it's going to say, this is the name of the record, and we're going to point it to another domain. And because in that case, what is happening is that the vendor is now handling your private key and public key rather than giving you the public key and the private key. They're going to handle it. They're going to take care of it. They're going to do everything that needs to get done. But there will be some cases where you may have to create it on your own, or they may actually give you the public key. And in those situations, that's where you're creating more of a TXT record. Okay, so I'm going to show you both. I'm going to show you the CNAME method, and then I'm going to show you the TXT method as well. So we're going to go back into Office 365. So this being a third-party vendor, the Office 365 actually uses CNAME records. So what you have to do is on the Admin Center, if you go all the way down to Exchange, this will open up another window, and in this window, you go to Protection. Then under Protection, you go to the DKIM tag, right? Because this is all your filtering is happening, your malware and connection and so on. But then you also add DKIM. Now in here, by default, there are two DKIM domains. The default one is always going to be your company name .onmicrosoft.com. So your domain.onmicrosoft.com. That one is actually enabled by default. So all your messages are actually being signed using this DKIM key. So when you look, if you ever look at the signature and you look at the domain, you'll actually see gotdmarc.onmicrosoft.com. And it actually passes, right? Because the signature is for gotdmarc.microsoft.com. It looks it up and it finds it. And says, okay, there's a public key, let's match it, and I hope and everything should pass. Problem happens is with DMARC alignment, right? Because .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com is not going to match the from address. So if you're using DKIM verification by itself, you're fine. But once you implement DMARC, alignment is going to be off, and you have to make sure you enable DKIM signing for got.dmarc.org. So that will fix those DKIM alignment issues. But you can't just go in and click on enable, even though there's an enable button there, right? Because if I click on the enable button right now, it's going to give me an error. It's going to say that my CNAME records don't exist. So please create those first, and then you can come back and enable this once we find and detect that those records actually exist, right? And the reason for that is because they want you to have the public key, whatever it be the CNAME or TXT, they want you to be present first before enabling signing, which makes sense. Because why would you sign something, but there's nothing to check against? It doesn't exist. So you want that record to exist to check against, and then have the signing turned on. So in this case, remember, CNAME. So we're creating a CNAME, and the nice thing is it actually gives you the values of the records. So these are not the names of the records. These are the values of the records you're creating. So there's two, selector 1 and selector 2. So I'm going to copy this. So what are the actual values, or the actual name of the records? The name of the records for Microsoft always are selector 1 _ domain key and selector 2 _ domain key. You have no choice on that. Because if you decide to put in a different selector name or a different host name, it's not going to work. It won't work with Office 365. So we need to create two CNAME records here. So I'm back in DNS Manager. I right click and I choose new alias CNAME. So in here, the name I give it, selector 1 _ domain key. And then a fully qualified domain name where I'm pointing it to, and I'm pointing it to. So also you notice that this domain name says got.dmarc.onmicrosoft.com. So it's actually telling you to go back to dmarc.onmicrosoft.com and use that for the key, for the public key. So that's why you can't disable that other one. You need to leave it alone. So I created one, and now let me create the second one. So again, right click, new alias CNAME, selector 2 _ domain key. And then the fully qualified domain name. And I got to change this from a 1 to a 2. So that way they're both unique. So you can have more than one DKIM record. There's a restriction on that. So you can have more than one DKIM record. I expect you to have more than one. In fact, I think at Global Cyber Alliance, I think we have probably like about 5 or 6 DKIM records for DKIM keys, and a mixture of CNAME and text records. So now these DKIM public keys or domain records are for just this one, mail for Outlook Office 365. Well, I have 2 Exchange servers. So unless I have these Exchange servers flowing through Office 365, then everything is fine. Your SPF is fine, and your DKIM records are fine. But what if you don't have that? What if that's not the situation? I want my Exchange 1 and Exchange 2 are actually sending mail on their own. They're not using Office 365, right? Because maybe it's a whole set of different users, or I haven't migrated them quite over yet. So what do I do in that situation, right? Because by default, MS Exchange does not have built-in DKIM signing or DKIM key generation capabilities. What you can do is you can use a third party, you can use if you have an email security gateway, some of those will actually will do key generation and key signing, DKIM signing. So I know like Iron Ports and Mimecast, just to name a few. They actually support DKIM key generation and DKIM signing capabilities. But say you don't have those either, you just have Exchange servers and that's it. Well, what you can do is install a tool called DKIM-Exchange, something that you can get and download for free from GitHub. So DKIM-Exchange from GitHub, GIT hub. Okay, it's free to download, only get it from there, because that's where the person who developed it, that's where they published it, and that's where they put it. Now you would install that on each Exchange server, right? Because each Exchange server is going to be responsible for the signing of every messages coming through that system. So it's installed on each server. So I actually have it installed on this machine. It's going to error out on me because I don't have, it's not detecting the Exchange version I have. So I don't actually have Exchange on here. I actually have I do have SMTP virtual system set up on here. But either way, once it runs, this is what you're going to see. It'll provide you all with all the information that you have about your system and your Exchange server and so on. But what you need to do is you need to go to domain settings. Under domain settings is where you're going to create your DKIM key and then also enable your DKIM signing. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on add, and this adds the domain. And here, just fill in all the blanks. So what's the domain name? It's got DMARC.org. Now here, when you're creating a selector, this is where you can define whatever you want your selector to be. You're not restricted to anything at this point. You can put in numbers, you can put in letters. Okay, you just can't put in characters. So it's numbers and letters. I mean, you could put in dashes, but I mean, it's either numbers or letters that you're gonna be putting in here. So you can put in, so if you want to be consistent, I can go with selector 3. Or what people do is they put in the date. I'm going to put in Exchange 1 because that way I know which server this key is associated with. So if I have a problem with it, I know which server to go to. So it has to do with Exchange Server 1. You do have the option of 1024 or 2048. I mean, if you can use 2048, Windows DNS does support 2048. But the older ones only support 1024, so be careful on this. The newer ones that support 2048. If using cloud DNS, majority of them will be either one or the other. Work with the help desk to determine that. If you put in a 24/8 key and it doesn't take it, email the help desk first to see if they'll put it in for you before you reduce it down to 1024. There are some that just don't support 2048, so you have no choice but to use 1024. So at that point here, all I have to do is now click on Generate New Key. It asks me what folder do I want to save it in. I'm going to save it here. It does exist, but I'm going to replace him. And it gives me all the information that I need to create my DNS record. I have to click on Save Domain in order to be able to use this for DKIM signing. Okay? So you have to take that into account. So this has to be, this tool here, this Exchange DKIM signer needs to be set up on each Exchange server in order for this to work. And the only way you can have it set up if you don't need to install on all the servers is to have email security gateway where mail flows through, and as long as that supports it, then it will. So someone's asking if our email goes out through like a Barracuda archiver or spam filter, will the signing get stripped? I think for Barracuda it does not, but this is a very good question though, because there are some systems that may strip it out. So be very careful with that. And this is also where you may have to set up your ADKIM in their DMARC policies and keep it to relaxed, or at least for ASPF you keep it to relaxed. Just make sure that the Barracuda archiver spam filter, if that's where all the mail is going through and that's what people are seeing publicly, then you may have to put that IP address in the SPF. But it depends again how mail is flowing. So let's create this record. So now that we have the information, let's create the record. So what this will tell you, it will give you the suggested DNS name, exchange1._domainkey.dmarc.org. Now remember, when it comes to these copying of records, you do not necessarily copy the whole thing. You only need to copy parts of it, but I'm going to copy the whole thing just so you can see what happens. So I'm creating a text record again. So if I right click and go to Other New Record, scroll down, choose TXT, create record. If I go ahead and just paste that whole information in, look what I have now. If I fully qualify domain name, I have exchange1._domainkey.dmarc.org.dmarc.org. It put it in there twice. That's not a valid record, and you're going to have problems. So what do you have to do? Get rid of that fully qualified domain name at the end. Remember, in Windows, it automatically appends the domain name. So be careful when you're just copying and pasting. The text, I'm going to take all this information here. What they're suggesting as a DNS record. So I'm just going to copy this, so that way I'm not missing anything. And then I'm going to just paste this in here. Click on OK. And now I have my DKIM set up for Exchange 1. And then I would repeat these steps on Exchange 2. So I go to the Exchange 2 server, install a DKIM Exchange on there, run the same thing, .DMARC, give it a different selector name, call it exchange2._domain key, and copy paste everything that I need to paste it to DNS. So that's the situation in which this will occur. Now let's create a DMARC record. So to create a DMARC, so again, there's nothing in Office 365 that's going to tell me to create a DMARC record, nor is it going to tell me how to create a record. So I'm going to just create the record based on what I just talked about in those past few slides. There are tools out there that you can use to help you with the process of going through about creating the record. So like GCA has a setup guide. Just go through the setup guide, and it'll go through each of the tags, and then you could, at the end, you get your record, what the record should look like. So here, I'm just going to create the record. So remember, for DMARC, it's always going to be a TXT or a text file. So if I go down here, right-click, choose Other New Record, scroll down here, choose TXT, and then create record. And now I'm just going to start creating it. So remember, for DMARC, the name must always be _DMARC. On Windows, we don't have to supply the fully qualified domain name. It's automatically done. So just _DMARC. And then the text box is where I put in the value. So I start putting in v equals DMARC 1 semicolon. I'm going to use the p tag next, right? Because that's required. Let's start off with p equals none, right? So those are the two first required values that you need to put in. Now I'm going to put in sp equals reject. Why? Because, well, you know what? I'm not using any subdomains, so therefore I'm going to use reject. Then I'm going to put in RUA equals mail to, and then the email address that I want these reports to be delivered to. Do you need a space after the semicolon? No, you do not. I only put the space in because it just makes it easier to read. And put the RUF tag, and there you go. Just click on OK, and now I have my DMARC record. Right, and those are all the things that I need. I didn't define FO, I didn't define anything else. So by default, FO is set to equal 0. My reporting interval is going to be 24 hours. My ADKIM and ASPF, they're both set to relaxed. And this is where then now I can go in and make the adjustments that I need to make. So now say I reviewed all my reports, I feel comfortable. Now I'm just going to change this. I'm going to get rid of the SP tag, but I'm going to make P equals to reject. So now I'm at the reject level. Other thing that I noticed in my reports, hey, my DKIM always seems to be using .dmarc.org. I have not seen any subdomain variations or levels, so I'm going to add in ADKIM equals S. However, for SPF, I've seen some oddities where it does seem to be using subdomains on occasion, so I'm going to leave that to relaxed. Right, so here I am making my adjustments to this. And all I have to do is hit apply, hit OK, and there you go, I made my adjustments. So that's how simple it is in creating a DMARC policy. As you can see, it's done. This is DMARC now. And this is what all you guys would have to do, is just take that same information, put it into it, and put it in there. So that's it. So I showed you how to create a selector. Sorry, I showed you how to create SPF. Showed you two different types of domain keys. So CNAME and a text record, and using a tool to create your own text record, and then how to create your DMARC record. So let me show you a few other things too. So I happen to have another domain here, gotdmarc.net, right? And we're just going to make something up here. So say that there should be A records and whatnot in here. But say I actually have a domain, I use it for www. And I'll make something up, 18.10. Oops. Hopefully, I mean, that might actually be somebody, but whatever. This is not an actual DNS server, so I'm just going to make up an IP. So I only use this for a web presence. I don't use it for any other purposes. I don't use it for mail, right? I use it for maybe eventually sometime down the line I may use it for FTP or some other services, but I don't want to use it for mail. So what do I do in this case? Because I want to still protect this, because even though I don't have an MX record or anything in there, it doesn't mean that somebody else can't go in and start using .dmarc.net for email purposes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click and create two different records. So, and they're going to be, both of them are going to be TXT records. So the first one I'm going to create is going to be an empty SPF record. So remember SPF, there's no record name, but I need to put in the values, v equals SPF1, but it's going to be empty by just putting in -all. So I'm not putting MX, I'm not putting include, A, or any other tags associated with SPF. Right? This at this point is considered an empty SPF record. So that means no servers or domains are allowed to use this domain name for email purposes. So if someone who has just SPF verification enabled, they check this, they're going to say, okay, well, we shouldn't be getting anything from .dmarc.net, so this message is considered a fail. All right, so v equals SPF1-all. But then we also need a DMARC policy. So I'm going to go in again, great. Another TXT record, right? Always start with _DMARC, and then put in your text, v equals DMARC1. Remember, always start with v equals DMARC1, followed by the p tag, in this case, p equals reject. And technically, that's all you need. That's it. You're done. There's nothing more that's needed than this. But you know what? I'm curious, and I want to know if this is being used. Well, the thing is I can't send it to an email address at .dmarc.net because it doesn't exist. So where do I send it to? I'm going to send it to the .dmarc.org. So we do have it, right? So RUF equals, whoops, forgot the mail2 colon. Right, I forgot the mail2 and colon here. So mail2, remember, it always has to start with mail2 colon and then the email address. And that's it. Done. Now, if you recall previously, I said, well, you can't just send to an external domain that's outside of your domain, right? So .dmarc.net is not in the .dmarc.org domain. Technically, these are two different domains, right? Because it's .net and .org. They're completely different from each other. So how is .dmarc supposed to allow these reports to come in? Well, this is how we do it. We go to .dmarc.org, and .dmarc.org has to create a record. So we're going to create another record here, and it's going to be a text record. So I right-click, Other New Record, scroll down to TXT, choose Create Record, and now the record name is not just going to be _DMARC. The way the record name is going to be, it's got to be the domain that's going to be sending you the reports. So it's got DMARC.net is sending me the reports. _report, right? Because these are reports that are being sent. _DMARC, and then the fully qualified domain name. And then the text is going to equal to v equals DMARC1 semicolon, and that's it. So you're basically saying that .dmarc.org is allowing DMARC reports from .dmarc.net. And then you just click on OK and done. And that's the only way that that email address is going to be able to receive reports. Google makes an exception for whatever reason. They still send the report regardless, even if you're not accepting reports from that domain. So if they put your email address in there, you'll still get reports, because some people have done that. They followed our videos to the letter, then they used smirs@dmarc.org. And I am actually getting reports from, I think, 2 or 3 other organizations that I'm not supposed to be accepting reports from, because I do not have this record in place. And it's Google. They're all Google reports. So just take that into consideration. So be careful and wary. So not just anyone can accept your reports. You have to set these 2 things up in order to allow for reports to be accepted. So those are the different ones, the different things that you can do with SPF, DMARC, and DKIM. So what are the next steps here? So go ahead, implement DMARC at p equals none for your organization, right? Because we gave you the record name _DMARC, and we gave you the value that you need to start off with, right? So all you need is v equals DMARC1 semicolon, p equals none semicolon, RUA equals mail2 colon the email address, and so on. That's all you need to get started. Right, and it shouldn't, as you saw, it didn't take long to actually create these records, at least for DMARC. right? For DKIM and SPF, yes, that is going to take some time. It's not going to be just as quickly as I just did it now, right? Especially if you have third-party vendors, because you got to go to each one of them and see what needs to be done, right? In some cases, you may have to contact the help desk to get some of the information. So that's going to take a little bit of time, but implementing DMARC, at least at the lowest level of none, is relatively quickly. The hard part is getting to quarantine and reject, because it's going to take time to update SPF. It's going to take time to create some of those DKIM records that you may need. So please, at any point in time when you're going through this process, go ahead and implement it and ask any questions that you need, right? You can email us, you can go to the community forum, and there are other subject matter experts on there, and hopefully they'll start speaking up, but there are people there as well. Or you can always call us as well and say, hey, look, I need help with this, and we'll set up a conference call to help you get started and help you get going. So as a reminder, if you're interested in it, we're doing the same exact session, but with Bind on October 2nd, and we're also going to do it on October 3rd with the Cloud DNS. So just a reminder, the first half is going to be the same exact of what you saw today. It's just the latter half. I'm going to show you how to create in a Bind system, so on Linux, and then on the third, show you how to use it in a Cloud DNS. Otherwise, the first half will be the same exact thing. And then weeks 5 and 6, so all about ongoing management, right? Because now you have a policy at none, you have RUA and RUF in place. What are these reports? What exactly am I seeing in here? Should I be looking at the XML, or are there human readable tools that I can use? Okay, I have a tool that I can use, but still I don't get this. What does it mean if SPF is passing or failing? What does it mean if it's fail on a line? What does all of this mean, and what are some options that I have and what changes I can make? That's what these subject matter experts are going to talk about in the next 2 weeks, so weeks 5 and 6. So please make sure you're registered for those. If not, contact us and we'll send you the links for weeks 5 and 6, and you can join whichever sessions, if not all of them, that you choose to join. So I know it's 1:03 p.m. Eastern, so we're 3 minutes over. I mean, we did start 2 minutes late, but I'm still going to stay on just to answer some of the questions that I think I see on here and go through those. If you cannot stay, then thank you. Thank you for joining. I hope to see you maybe in the next Bind and Cloud DNS. If not, I hope to see all of you at the sessions for weeks 5 and 6. So you feel free to email me, gca-dmarc@globalcyberalliance.org, or email me directly. So I am part of the gca-dmarc@globalcyberalliance.org group. So you'll get emails from me, but you can always email me directly if you choose to. So let's go through some questions here. There's not too many. So if we put in a DMARC policy of reject, can the receiver side still let the failed emails go through to the recipient? Yeah, they actually can. They can actually override your policy. So not all security gateways give you that option, but a good chunk of them give you that option. And I know some of the email service providers will do that. So I believe Microsoft, I think, does that. They actually, if you have a policy of reject, they actually drop it down to quarantine. So yes, they do have that option. Why they would do that, I'm still not quite certain, because who knows best about their environment than the actual sending organization. But yes, the receiving side does have an option to override your DMARC policy. Are there any other vendors other than DKIM Exchange? Yes, there are. There are quite a few that are out there, but I know people are saying, well, with DKIM Exchange, they're saying that they need developers and help to maintain it, but that's still the most popular one. DKIM Exchange is the most popular one because it seems to be the one that seems the most seamless and the one that actually works the best. Some of the other ones that I've heard of, they don't work so great, and I haven't seen them used very often. So that's why we point to DKIM Exchange. Really, the best thing to do is if you have an email security gateway, use that. So if you have an Iron Port or a Mimecast, I think Proofpoint has some tools. I think some of the new Barracuda systems actually start doing it now. There's a whole slew of lists of ones that do it. If those systems do it on there and have it done there rather than installing something like on the actual servers themselves. Can the RUA be used as a phishing vector, since I assume it is visible in the clear? Yeah, so that's why I mentioned before that, yes, I mean, the DMARC policy is public. So instead of using your own personal work account, use a generic account. So use something like DMARC at or DMARC-RUA at and DMARC-RUF at. So it's going to a generic account rather than sending it to your own personal account. That's your best way to avoid that, because yes, people can go in, get those email addresses, and then start spamming you at that address. All right, so those are all the questions I see. So I think I've hit everything. It is 1:06 p.m. Eastern. If I see another 1 or 2 questions, I will stay on till at least 1:10 p.m. Eastern. If I don't see something in the next minute or two, then we will go ahead and end the session. Right, so this session has been recorded. One of the at this point is 5 sessions that we've done. So one of the 5 sessions will be put up as a on the website, the website that's available. We're not going to put all 6. We're just going to put one of the 6 up. So just want to watch out for that. Most likely will not be up until the end of the week. So just be on there. So probably Thursday or Friday, you'll probably see this session up on that site. So this is another question more about reporting, but I'm going to answer it. So the reports that you get come in as zipped file. You get an email, it comes in with a zipped attachment, right? If you really want to look at the XML, yeah, go ahead and open up the zipped attachment. But otherwise, if you use these third-party tools, some are free, some of them you pay for, you don't open the zipped file. You actually just upload the zipped file and then let them handle it. Or you send the reports directly to them and let them handle it. So that way you don't have to worry if you're concerned about those zips. This is how to avoid those. If you're still worried about it, then just download the zip into a sandbox and then open it up there. But honestly, I have yet to see or receive one that's harmful. But that doesn't mean that there won't be. So just because I haven't seen it yet doesn't mean that at some point in time there might be 1 or 2. So best bet is really don't open. I mean, you don't want to look at the XML anyway. It can be just eye-boggling, and your brain just is going to get, yeah. It's best to use some sort of XML to human convert it so it's something easily to read and easy to understand. And those tools, you just upload the zip file. You don't actually have to. You don't even have to unzip it. So that's where your safety comes into play. And there are free tools out there as well that you just push them the zip file, and they will automatically unzip it, post it up so it's a human readable format. And if you are interested in some of those free tools, send me an email and I'll give you a list of those free tools. So that way you don't have to wait till the very last session, October 17th, to get that list. But the deal is, you got to put in P equals none. So, okay, I'm just going to wait 1 more minute, and then we're going to go ahead and end the session. So again, thank you for joining us. I hope a lot of this information was useful to you, and I hope that you actually put in a P equals none of DMARC policy before the end of the boot camp. And again, we're always happy to help you in any way that we can to get you through this process. All right, it's 1:10 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you everyone for joining the session. And at this time, I'm going to be closing out the webinar. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.